everybody. You're listening to The Progressive American. The following is an interview I conducted with Dr. Christopher Budzisz, a friend of the show, and we were discussing the relationship between Ukraine and Russia and what we can expect to see going forward. While things have changed since the interview was conducted, I think it is important to remember and understand how the information presented is useful to the public and how we can understand the conflict going forward. I hope you all enjoy and have a wonderful day. Alrighty, I am sitting here with Dr. Christopher Budzisz, who is a professor of political science and constitutional law at Loras College. He's also been responsible for teaching many of the students there about the situation in Ukraine, even before the Russian movements as of late. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Connor.
It's my pleasure. So starting off, I thought I'd get into some of the distinctions between how a lot of the reporting has been handled. A lot of the discussion surrounding Ukraine has largely centered around the United States and Russia's interactions over what's happening, but there's not a lot of discussion about how Ukrainian people feel about it. And as somebody who's been familiar with some of the politics there, who's actually been there, I was wondering if you could give a kind of synopsis of not only how the Ukrainian political system and political figures feel about it, but also what we could see about the distinctions of like everyday people.
Right. I think it's a really important observation. And I completely agree that most of the time when we're having conversations about the current situation in Ukraine, or for that matter, with previous events, for instance, the first invasion of Crimea and the Donbass region in far eastern Ukraine, I agree with you that the focus tends to be on this kind of great powers conversation. What's the U.S. interest and strategic interest in relationship? What is the United States thinking, or NATO allies? And what is Russia doing? And what are Russian-backed separatists and those type of groups? What is their point? But primarily focused on U.S. position, Russian position. And what gets lost is, the people actually having to live through these conflicts and potential conflicts, the Ukrainians. So I do think it's very vital when we have conversations about things like potential military conflicts or invasions, that what gets lost in this is that we don't let the Ukrainians themselves get lost, or the Ukrainian government. Oftentimes, I think that is a tendency in Western media and media generally to kind of get very narrowly focused on one set of interests, and to provide it as a kind of the Russians become the other side of the argument, whereas in fact there's the Ukrainians who are living through it all. So I think that's vital. In terms of the Ukrainian view of things, I think one of the things that's really been interesting in the last few weeks especially, and this was true even today, in which Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, the UK Prime Minister, was in Kyiv and met with the Ukrainian President Zelensky and other officials. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister came out and articulated a view of the Russian military buildup that honestly is different in its tone. It still recognizes it as a fundamental problem and a threat to Ukrainian sovereignty. However, the Ukrainians, especially in the last couple of weeks, have tended to say not that war is imminent, but that they are prepared and they are remaining calm, and they are not going to rush to judgments as to what exactly is going to happen, but that they will be prepared. So the language within Ukrainian policymakers, especially ones who might be more Western aligned, many of them are not using the same kind of dire warning that maybe Prime Minister Johnson or President Biden has used. So it's not that they don't see that the threat exists. In fact, they're more aware of it than the Americans and the UK politicians are, but that they want to remain measured, partly because they're having to govern the country and deal with the population, and they don't want to spread panic. In fact, Foreign Minister Kuleba today in Ukraine indicated that Russian forces that are on the borders are not sufficient to actually complete a full-scale invasion, right? So he's actually not downplaying the threat, but indicating that that he doesn't use the language of imminent threat or imminent invasion the same way that maybe the United States has used and the UK has used. It's not that the threat doesn't exist. They wholeheartedly see it as an existential threat, but the question of imminence is one that I do think you see a difference. You also asked about on the ground. I have I have friends remaining in Ukraine now, and some who are expats living abroad in Europe. And one of the things that is clear is that Ukrainians, especially in the East, are prepared, and they have extra storage of food in many cases, things like that. But that life goes on, and traffic flows, businesses are open, stores are stocked. So I think there's fear, there's trepidation, there's concern by many in the population. But you got to remember, they've been in a constant state of conflict, both armed and otherwise, for years and years and years now, and has taken the lives of thousands and thousands of Ukrainians. We cannot forget that this is not a new development. In some ways, this is a continuation of many, many years of armed conflict, in addition to other conflict, economic conflict, cyberspace, all those kind of other elements. So from what I can gather from international press and from conversations, it appears that many people are keeping an eye on the situation. They're concerned, but there isn't a kind of panic in the streets or those type of kind of frenzied kind of activities at this point. I think there's concern, obviously, and you have seen a call up of territorial troops, readiness, kind of a National Guard type preparedness, as well as individuals trying to kind of sign up for those kind of units. So preparations continue for what might happen, but panic in the street is not something that's not something that's occurring at the moment. Certainly concern.
So yeah, and there's a couple layers to that, because on the one hand, the way in which it is discussed in the United States represents almost an abstraction of the human conditions of what we're seeing in Ukraine and the relationship with Russia. But it also represents, I think, a failure to some extent of the United States media to represent the continued struggle in Ukraine since Crimea.
Right.
But to add to that, I was wondering if you could kind of address some of the things that the Russian government has said about, for example, the rise of the far right in Ukraine, and how they've kind of used that as a pretext to do things like this. For example, I believe it was their foreign minister who referred to some of the groups that support the current Zelensky government as outright Nazis. I was wondering if you could kind of get into the Russian government's relationship with the far right, and how that kind of contributes to almost an increase in tensions with Ukraine, and also how it influences the far right across Europe.
Right. I'll step back and make a general observation on that. I do think it's very important for observers of Russian politics and U.S. politics and this situation in Ukraine to consider the media environment in all of those countries. So I know, for most individuals, they're not going to be Russian speakers, but if you do, there are some good sources. But even if, Russian's not your language, there are good English language sources that can get at how the Ukrainian situation and groups within Ukraine are treated, and how the US and NATO is discussed within the domestic Russian media. And I think it's very, very vital to understand that the media consumption within Russia is controlled, is measured, is impacted by the regime. And so there's a limited kind of constructed vision of events. So if you actually look at Russian internal media, NATO is the aggressor, Ukraine is a threat to the territorial sovereignty of Russia, that Ukraine is imminently going to join NATO, park nuclear strategic missiles on the border, and ultimately take Crimea back and try to destabilize Russia. So who the aggressor is very much there's kind of a script involved as to what's going on. And to your specific question about far right groups, that has been an issue that you've seen actually covered pretty well by people like Christopher Miller, who writes for BuzzFeed. So if any of your readers and listeners are interested in kind of following up on some of those threads, there's no doubt that there is a kind of far right fascistic element that exists in the kind of Ukrainian extreme. Now, it's a very small number, very limited group, but it's been used, I think, very effectively and propaganda-wise by Russia, for instance, to tap into that long-running concern over this fascism, the threat of fascism. Remember, that's a long-running element in 20th century history in this conflict between Russia and how Russia looks at the West, for instance, hearkening back to Germany and the rest, and conflicts there that cost millions of people's lives. So that's an example of which that's a talking point within Russian media that is used effectively to demonstrate the threat being posed within Ukraine and by Ukraine on Russia. Now, along with that threat of kind of difference, and is that it's juxtaposed oftentimes by a contrast with the shared history. So within the last year, President Putin put out an op-ed piece in which he spoke about or wrote about the fact that the history of Ukraine and Russia are essentially as one people, right? Mm-hmm. That Ukraine as a separate entity, a sovereign entity, is not rooted in history. Now, there's plenty of Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationalists and just, moderate Ukrainians who would beg to differ quite a bit. But nonetheless, that's kind of a position that gets tacked with oftentimes the maybe the fascist threat or something that occurs within some of these battalions and militia movements within Ukraine, as it gets coupled with that's going against that shared history and that shared common identity between Russia and Ukraine and the Russian people and the Ukrainian people. So you'll always definitely have to be mindful of how Ukraine and how internal issues within Ukraine are being presented inside Russian media. That's definitely the case. And I will say that, it's not just online sites and the rest. There's Russian television news and evening kind of news talk programs are very popular, and some of the hosts are particularly kind of well known within the country and can tend to be seen as an extension of Kremlin position on something.
Mm. So it's kind of an interesting narrative, because on the one hand, that fear of fascism has particular cultural strength within Russian history because of its relationship with Germany. But at the same time, the Russian government of today is not some typical left-wing Marxist-Leninist political system. And it also has a history of its own attempts with its disinformation campaigns to utilize the far right in other countries like the AfD in Germany to destabilize other countries. So I'm wondering, to circle back to kind of how you mentioned how the Ukrainian people it's nothing new to them, but they're also aware of the fear. What response do the Ukrainian government have to deal with, say, further military movements from the Russian government? And what methods have they been trying to use to avoid such military incursions if they were to come to pass?
So the Ukrainian military that existed at the time of the 2014 outbreak, so Crimea and what happened in the Donbass, parts of Luhansk and Donetsk, it's much more, it has been strengthened since then in terms of material, but also in terms of capability of training. And another element to it, I've been back. I was in Ukraine a couple of times since that initial taking of Crimea and the far east, parts of the far east of the country. And one of the things I noticed was a ramping up of kind of national symbols. So whether it's the flag, but also just colors, things like that, in ways in tying it explicitly to defense of country and of military recruitment and of recruiting people who might be in like the IT sectors, which is very strong in Ukraine, to work along with some of these volunteer groups that aid and assist the military, and then actually joining government agencies that are related to the Department of Defense and defense issues. A ramping up of kind of military preparedness and seeing the military as something very close to the continued strength and prosperity of the nation in a way that you wouldn't have seen, and I never saw in the early 2000s. You wouldn't see all these kind of open discussions of the military in the same way, and this idea of the centrality of the military to defend something that's uniquely Ukrainian, and that all people need to contribute, and that the recruitment for the armed forces is so vital. So the military has become more prepared. The military has strengthened its arsenal. That being said, it is not equipped or trained to deal with a all-out conventional war with Russia. It just does not have the fire. If you want to use those kind of crass language, it just doesn't have that kind of firepower. I'm not a military expert along those lines, but observing it, it doesn't have the capacity. If what's going to happen is an all-out, grand invasion, which is designed to control and, submit to its will the whole country in a full military invasion. However, the Ukrainians are better prepared. The Ukrainians are also don't just think of this, and the Ukrainian government just doesn't think of this in a conventional war. And that's another, I think, tendency of the media to focus on, is the tank buildups and the troop buildups and Buk missile systems and things like that, which are all very important to report on. But there's also the reality of hybrid war, of conflict occurring in the economic space and cyberspace that has continued throughout this period, and destabilizing the system through, black ops or, efforts that are designed to, be false flag operations. Those kind of things are also part of what this conflict is all about. And the Ukrainians have stepped up and increased, for instance, their intelligence services, their ability and to intercept communications, their monitoring of communications. So the intelligence services, I think, have stepped up and there's been a focus on those kind of things, because it's not simply, will 150,000 Russian troops invade? It's also, are there going to be provocative actions that occur that are not by people in military uniform, that are by, Russian actors or other actors brought in by Russians to kind of foment dissent or to target infrastructure, things like that. And you've seen in the past couple of weeks, there's been some arrests related to people who have been claimed to be tied to such operations. So that's been one element of kind of preparation, is that the government hasn't seen it simply as the need to prepare for something like an all-out military invasion with, hundreds of, tens of dozens and dozens of tanks and 100,000 military personnel and missile systems. The other thing the government has done, and you've seen this very clearly, especially in the last couple of weeks, is the Ukrainian government making appeals for military assistance, especially in the form of equipment. Now, the United States has been involved in Western Ukraine for quite some time in assisting in the training of Ukrainian troops, in particular subfields and in particular areas. Uh, so the United States has, and this was true during the Trump administration, has been involved in training some elements of the Ukrainian military. That's been true in cooperation with NATO as well, and invitations to Ukraine to participate in some trainings. So asking for assistance, receiving assistance, the United States, the UK, as I mentioned, Prime Minister Johnson visit, like a state visit there, but also the Baltic countries have been very strong advocates for assisting in terms of material. Poland as well. So neighbors of Russia who are members of the NATO alliance have responded to that. So the Ukrainian government, part of what the Ukrainian government has done is to say, we need material because we need better equipment. And some countries have responded to that call. So that's been something else that's been going on.
And that kind of goes to the point of, what Russia is actively attempting to do here in terms of like what we're dealing with is a conventional all-out war that you mentioned how Ukrainian officials have explicitly said, we don't think that they have enough troops to hold the country if that is their intention. So I was wondering if you can go into, if not an invasion, what is the point of this massive display of force so close to the Ukrainian border, as well as troops being deployed in Belarus by the Russian government, and what role that plays in how the world really should respond to this?
Right, and it's difficult to it's a difficult question to answer. But here's what I would say is paramount to this is that I don't think an analysis should look to one explanation. There is not going to be a single kind of explanation for why is this happening, but rather I think this is a case in which you've got multiple factors involved, and that putting those together, you can get a sense of, okay, this is why, or this is maybe the approach, and it may give you a sense of where things are going. Now, that being said, once you identify a few factors that may explain this current situation, these kind of situations oftentimes take on their own kind of internal logic. So what might be the intention of a country or a leader strategically at the beginning, at the onset of a potential conflict, because it elicits response and then another response and another response, sometimes can take on a logic of its own, to where what might be the intent at the beginning is no longer within the grasp of the actors involved at the end. And that's one thing I think that security experts, international security experts, always get concerned with, is that conflicts take on their own kind of internal logic in which tit for tat occurs, and the ability to de-escalate a situation becomes more and more difficult, when the original intent may not be full-scale military conflict. Internal logic of events can sometimes cause a kind of runaway effect, and I think that that's always one of the things that international security experts are always so worried about. So in terms of explaining how we get here and why, and what might be next, a couple of things to remember. One, what we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years, and actually going back even longer than that, in Russia's relationship with its neighbors, what we're seeing in Ukraine isn't completely new. So for instance, Russian forces are in Georgia, in the country of Georgia. And not only are they there to bolster a couple of breakaway regions, but in years past, the Russian forces left those breakaway regions and started heading toward Tbilisi, the capital, essentially to assert a kind of influence over what was going on in Georgia at the time. So there's an example. Russian forces are in Transnistria and have been in Transnistria, which is a breakaway region of Moldova, which is a country that borders to the kind of southwest, or the south central part of Ukraine. Moldova is one of the smallest, is a small country, very poor country, but has internally a division. And part of the country, from its independence period, they went actually into a brief civil war. Russian forces are in Moldova and have been in Moldova for decades now. And that is on the border of Ukraine. The most kind of closest big city you might heard of is Odessa in terms of within Ukraine. But that's a border region, or that's a country on the border. And within that country, there's a breakaway region which has its own capital, has its own currency, but is not recognized by the world, but yet has Russian troops in there as part of, an exertion or an extension of Russian kind of military presence in the region and security operations in the region. It claims peacekeeping, but it's been there for decades now. And then, as you mentioned, in Belarus, we've also seen in countries such as Kazakhstan, in recent times, very recent times, the Russian military intervention. So, in one sense, it's not new. So, it's assertion of control, influence through military means and direct military means is something that's not new. What is a little different in the case of Ukraine is that, if you remember, back to when Crimea and the breakaway regions in the east occurred, that conflict occurred. They were Russian troops, but they had removed all their insignias. And so they were actually operationally Russian troops there. They wanted to seize, among other things, the Black Sea port, Sevastopol in the Crimea, but also to assert an influence in the region. So what we're seeing here is that's part of the explanation, is that they are asserting influence in their region, security influence, and especially it gets especially prominent in countries in which the country is asserting its kind of own independent path that may be contrary to what Russia sees as its long-term security interests. So if Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian population was not trending more towards looking to NATO, and if it was looking more towards closer relationship with Russia, then I think this conversation may be different. So it's also a way to kind of influence the domestic trajectory of countries, especially a country which, and this is another explanation, is seen as historically so close to Russia as Ukraine is. And that does, I think, connect to Putin's vision of how he sees Ukraine in relationship to Russia. Most Western media focuses a heavy amount on the NATO explanation, and that NATO expansion. Here's a couple of things to consider. Ukraine today is no closer. Let me rephrase that. When the invasion in Crimea occurs, Ukraine wasn't a NATO member. Ukraine wasn't close to becoming a NATO member. There is no plan for Ukraine being a NATO member anytime soon. It's just not a reality. But the vision of NATO as a strategic opponent by Russia, seeing it as a strategic opponent, is very strong, and is something that Putin focuses a lot of attention on in his comments about the end. No more NATO expansion into onto the border. NATO's been on the border of Russia now for a very long time, whether it's the Baltics or Poland. There are border connections. The expansion of NATO that's occurred in the last decade or decade and a half has not been with Ukraine. It's been in places like Albania, right? And Croatia, those type of things, those type of places. So I think the NATO piece is talked about a lot, both by Putin and Russian media and Russian authorities, but also by the United States. But the reality is, how much of that is actually an explanation of what's going on here? In reality, it's tough. It's more about perception, I think. One ironic element is that, according to polling within Ukraine, more Ukrainians are supportive now of Ukraine taking a path towards NATO than they ever have been. So one ironic consequence of this might be drawing the Ukrainian population closer to NATO. But to be honest, back to what Ukrainian population wants, the vast majority of the population doesn't want any sort of armed conflict with Russia. So NATO is another thing that's kind of brought up, and Putin does make a very the other day when he was speaking with President Erdogan of Turkey, he answered, he talked about the situation in Ukraine, and he talked about past promises that the government, that the NATO alliance had made, and he sees those as broken. Whereas for NATO's point of view is that those promises were never made about expansion or about connection to Russia. And in Putin's comments, I do think you always have to be looking at words versus actions. Actions are always going to be more important than looking at words. However, words are not meaningless. There is meaning to what is being said. So it's a good sign when he says we will continue to talk. We hope that diplomatic approach can be used, but you also have to consider the actions on the ground. Otherwise, they're just words.
But yeah, I think a lot of the discussion surrounding NATO is either used in defense of Putin or as an indictment against him, particularly when you start seeing countries around Russia starting to signal that they might want to join when there's troop movements from Russia. But I also want to ask about how this may seem like, in a way, the discussion around NATO almost seems sort of like a distraction, a way to ignore the way in which Russia sees its sphere of influence in a way. Would you say that the part of the reason Russia keeps responding with its military is because it lacks the means to engage in soft power like the United States? Or would you say it's more due to a sense of desperation at its border, as Putin has mentioned?
Well, I would say one thing, that it's a tool that it's gotten used to using, so it becomes something that's done, right? I mean, it becomes easier to use it in the future. The other lever that I think you see used occasionally, it's not soft power, as you mentioned, but energy access, right? So the discussion over pipelines and the rest, and gas, in particular natural gas to Western Europe. That has been, for Ukrainians, access to energy resources has been one of the longest running points of conflict since Ukrainian independence. It is a running fact of life through the years for Ukrainians that once winter comes around, there will be some sort of tension or conflict with Russia, or that gas transit, because there's many transit lines that not only come into Ukraine to provide natural gas to the Ukrainians, but also transit the country and go into Europe, right? Into parts of Western Europe, I should say. The gas politics is something that Ukrainians are very, very well versed in, and very expected every winter, basically. The difference here, though, I think, there has been some media attention over Russia's connections, the Nord Stream pipeline and things. So the Russian connection as an energy supplier to Western Europe, to Germany especially, who looks very closely to some of these pipelines and natural gas reserves. So economics is one lever they use outside of military. But in terms of soft power, as you noted, one of the things that I think they do try to cultivate with that is connections with countries like Hungary, Serbia, countries that may have more of a kind of traditionalist social view. So that's one interesting thing about Putin from the beginning, has been a reaching out to, for instance, the Russian church, the Orthodox Church, and to not see the church under the kind of old communist view of religion, but to rather see it as part of the distinctiveness, cultural distinctiveness and power and background of Russia, right? As a source of strength rather than a kind of opposition to the government, or something to be, put aside. This is actually an element of kind of cultural cultural strength, perhaps, or a traditionalism, a kind of power, that I think there are appeals to that in some parts of the world. And I do think that sense of a leader standing up for, the country has appeal to certain segments, even within the American population. And that's why I think you see coverage of Putin different depending on what show you're in and channel you're watching, if you kind of get the subtext there. However, those are such simplistic views, because the average condition or the condition for many Russians in the country is not very good, and has in some ways gotten worse through time. There are some, really negative internal social and economic trends within Russia. And so I agree that they may not use soft power the way that some other countries do, but I do think there's elements there of this kind of cultural affinity, or a kind of play to traditionalism or historical roots, especially in places like Serbia or Hungary, that you do see attempts to use to be attractive as a way of influencing policy. I mean, Orban was just there in Russia. I think I said Erdogan before. I meant Orban. So the Hungarian president, Orban, was just there and met with President Putin. So I think you see those kind of connections. Hungary, Serbia, especially. So, and you do, yeah. I'll kind of leave it at that.
And I appreciate you pointing that out, because a lot of the discussion surrounding Russia is either its military aggression towards Ukraine or its neighbors, or its relationship with authoritarianism, but there's not a lot of discussion about its cultural influence and its relationship, say, with the Orthodox Church, like you brought up. But since we've been focusing so much on the Russia and Ukrainian side of things, and rather than, say, the United States, which is the traditional narrative, I was wondering if we could flip onto this and talk about what role the United States can play in this. Recently, the Associated Press, quite literally like an hour ago, released a report showing that there are documents that were leaked by the United States government that suggested that they may be willing to move some of their missile defense sites in Romania, as a sort of way to negotiate a way out of this conflict. Though that's far from guaranteed at the moment. Sorry, would you like to say something?
No, go ahead.
If that were to come to pass, or similar concessions were made, do you believe that would create a greater sense of peace between the United States and Russia and Ukraine, or would that further incentivize this form of, I don't want to say strong arm diplomacy, but it's the only thing I can think of to describe this approach?
I think, and I saw those reports too. I think there was this notion that there'll be figure out a way to assure the Russians that ballistic missiles are not parked, so close to them, that type of thing. And Romania has become a very, very close military partner with both the United States, and it is a NATO country, but in particular with the United States too. What do I think the effects of such things would be? One, I do think it could have a de-escalation effect, which would be welcome. If we were to look and to say that let's just say the worst case scenario, there is a major military invasion, full-scale military invasion, it will be devastating. And the people who will pay the brunt of this are Ukrainians, to be honest, and that should never get lost. We shouldn't get so tied up in the grand geostrategy that we forget that. However, I think it also is additionally has long-range consequences for stability in Europe, and in general in the international regimes. So it should be avoided. Now, there's multiple ways to avoid it. One could take these kind of measures, allowing inspections or allowing kind of confidence building measures. So in other words, we can gain confidence between the two, in this case, Russia and the United States, about what intentions are and what actions mean, right? And so that can help de-escalate. So those kind of things would certainly be welcome. However, many will advocate that what you do is you can do those kind of things, but you also need to increase the costs that might take place if Russia were to act and create a full-scale invasion. So continue to supply Ukrainians, continue to assist Ukrainians. So you can do both at the same time. The question really then becomes, will Russia accept that? Which then gets to the broader, more difficult question that I don't think anybody can answer, and I think it comes down to one person answering it, is would such measures be sufficient to change the trajectory long term in terms of Russia and Ukraine? I think such measures like the inspections regime that you mentioned can de-escalate. I don't think that alone changes a kind of fundamental belligerence that Russia has towards the sovereignty of Ukraine. This is there's a long-running history here, including the poisoning of political candidates in Ukrainian politics by suspected agents of foreign powers, Russia, and influence in Ukrainian politics. So I think it would be helpful. It would certainly de-escalate, but I don't see that as like a kind of a one-step solution to the problem. I think longer term and multiple levels of diplomacy would need to occur. And I think it would also be helpful to see more earnest and serious conversation around the efforts that were put in place that Russia kind of and the separatists kind of signed on to help negotiate a solution to the existing problem of Crimea and the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. That continues. There's soldiers killed. There's firing across the lines all the time in that standoff. So that's that kind of measure that's reported today doesn't undo that. There needs to be additional work. But such measures could be ways in which the United States and NATO allies address some concerns of Putin. But to be honest, I don't believe I don't believe that Putin would respond to that by saying, oh, okay, well then that's fine. And then we're going to take our military and go home. It's not the way he operates. It's not the way the regime operates. I think your question also, do I think it would encourage further strong arming? I don't know that it would encourage it, but we need to continue to expect it. So if you look at it from the American position, I think you want to keep walking this line between continuing to engage Russia, but also make sure you're engaging Ukraine in any of these conversations. I think sometimes what happens is that Washington understandably wants to have the conversation directly with Russia, but I would encourage more conversation in which Ukraine is part of that itself, right? So, and try to encourage those kind of measures from the US system. So I think you continue to support security arrangements, but you're unlikely to see President Biden do what President Bush said several years ago, which was to basically say, I think it was 2008, we want to essentially make a pathway for Ukraine into NATO. The position seems to be out of Washington now. The open door policy to NATO is non-negotiable. And I think that's the essence of the NATO alliance. If you apply to join and the alliance accepts, then you are bound to that treaty. I think that's non-negotiable. So when Russia, I'm afraid that the United States may make a concession, and then Putin says, "No, that's not enough. We need for you to close your open door policy." And I don't think the United States or NATO is or should be willing to do that.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me. I know that things are likely to continue to be somewhat chaotic and ever escalating. I'm sure that after this interview is concluded, there will be things that I wish I had asked you because of new reports. But are there any key points that you'd like to emphasize that didn't come up here?
I guess I would tell people, do not. So when people are consuming news, especially about a part of the world that they might not have any familiarity with, it becomes even more important for them to search out multiple sources, multiple media outlets, and to also look into the kind of background of the media outlets they're looking at and the reporters that they're looking at. So when you're less knowledgeable about a region or about a topic, I think it's even more important for you to do your due diligence around those kind of things. So that's, I think, one thing that's really important. And I would very much stress for Americans looking at this conflict and this potential conflict to realize this is not something that has just sprung up, that there is a history here and that a conflict has existed. So when we talk about Russia invading Ukraine, it already has, right? And threats to territorial sovereignty and integrity have existed for quite some time, while at the same time, Ukraine has had a long-running and very close relationship. Its peoples, its economies, its histories are intertwined. There's no doubt about that, but they are also separate. So I think people have to recognize that this is not something that's just occurring at the end of 2021 into 2022, but rather is a kind of extension of a longer running relationship that in the 21st century has actually been very, very difficult and has cost people's lives and been very difficult for Ukrainians in particular.
Well, I'd like to thank you again for joining me. And on that note, we can only hope that diplomacy prevails and we see a easing of tensions in the future.
Yeah, let's hope so.